Hi everyone, welcome back to ColivingDAO Insights. This is Daniel, and today we're going to be talking about the history of private property, something that could be considered quite controversial. On one end of the spectrum, we have socialism. We have people that believe that there should not be private property altogether. In fact, that's what causes inequalities. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, we have people that believe that it's a fundamental human right. So we'll be discussing all that throughout the history, and we'll be analyzing what could be a way forward as well. And I'm joined today by my co-host and co-founder, Gareth. How are you today, Gareth?
Hey Dan, yeah, it's great to be back. I'm feeling good, and this is a really interesting topic, so I'm really motivated to dive deep and see what we can discover.
That's awesome. And yeah, so when we talk about private property, one thing that comes to mind immediately is that it's considered a right, a fundamental human right. However, when you look at different rights, such as the right to free speech and the right to live, these are rights that don't really interfere with other people's rights, because you living doesn't prevent other people from living. However, when it comes to private property, if someone owns something, then other people cannot own the same thing. So there's already an argument here, and some people may argue that private property inherently creates inequality. What's your take on that, Gareth?
Yeah, there's loads of interesting controversy around the notion of private property, and it's something we kind of just we don't really think about it anymore, right? We just assume that this is the way things are done. And my take on it is there's a lot of, as you said, resource sharing implications. So, we only have one planet. We know that there is limited space and limited resources, and we somehow have to all get along together and find a way to share this planet. And that really links into, some of the environmental sustainability concerns around the world, but it also links into notions of power and control and how much power should private property owners have. There was a lot of power associated with owning land in the past. Becoming a landowner meant that you could become very wealthy potentially just because you owned a plot of land. And so the power and control element is also a really big part of the controversy around private property. And Dan, I think we looked at some of the ancient history of property to get a really clear idea on how this has developed through the history of human civilization. And we know that, human beings used to live in caves, right? Never used to have houses. We didn't own land. And that was the case for thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. So where did property actually start? Where did it all begin?
Exactly, that's a very good point. Private property was not always around, especially in the form that we understand it right now. In the beginning, there was even in hunter-gatherer societies, for example, there was a very different structure. It was a form of egalitarianism where all resources were shared equally among peers. And in fact, when people think about that, most of the time they think about some sort of happy-go-lucky society where everything is shared, everyone's happy, and there's no inequality, and therefore life is simpler and easier and more enjoyable. However, that's not necessarily the case. Even egalitarianism can be enforced sometimes very violently. So the lack of private property doesn't mean that there's no fights. And in fact, imagine being the best hunter in your village and being forced to share everything with the village. It works out, but what if you see everyone else being lazy and no one else wants to really hunt and you're the only one hunting, and then you're still forced to share everything, and then people that don't do anything still get the food. There's pros and cons. However, what's important to understand is that each system has got some advantages and disadvantages, and this was the system that was used in the beginning. Now, the limitation of the system is that it really prevented the ability to specialize. So when the type of resources is limited, when the type of tasks is limited, it worked quite well to share everything. But actually, as soon as the type of resources varied more, people had more and more needs, more and more tools were created, things started changing. But the biggest catalyst for the introduction of private property was the introduction of agriculture, and that was approximately 11,000 years ago. And when that happened, for the first time in history, there was effectively a very clear way to generate surplus that could be stored. Now imagine a hunter hunting big game, small game, whatever they find, and of course that cannot be stored for too long. So sharing makes a lot of sense. I can't really keep my game for generations, not even for my near future, because it would just no longer be usable, no longer be edible. When it comes to storing resources, now that, let's say 11,000 years ago, agriculture was introduced, humans had the ability to store resources, everything changed. So, on one hand, we had this opportunity of accumulating wealth that was not possible before. And the second thing is now land has got a big, big value because it's possible effectively to farm and get value from the land itself. So that's literally why this happened. And this introduction of agriculture effectively brought a lot of different shifts, but this is literally the number one catalyst for this shift. And what's your take on this, Gareth?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, we were hunter gatherers and living in the wilds of the ancient earth, and people were roaming freely, but then discovered, hey, we can actually grow plants and keep animals. But to do that, we need to kind of stay in the same place and protect our little plot of land. So just to bring it back to the notion of shelter, shelter being, an essential part of human survival. People realized in the agricultural age that if they protected a small piece of land where they could grow crops and keep animals, then they had an enhanced form of shelter, and they didn't need to necessarily keep moving around. And so the concept of land ownership appeared purely by the need to defend a piece of land, right, or keep a piece of land. And that was the beginning of property as we know it. So where did it go from there, Dan? Where did it go from the agricultural age? How did property actually become a thing at that point in time?
Yeah, you made a very good point here. Protecting the land effectively is one reason why private property started to exist. Having this property, and all of a sudden, if we have owners or simply farmers that want to get the most of that land, they need to make sure that they can farm without any disruptions. And in the beginning, it was quite a straightforward process, sometimes peaceful. Simply the farmers that were cultivating the land, farmers that were utilizing the land, they effectively claimed that as their own, and there was no violence involved. But in many cases, there was violence and power dynamics where uh, uh, some people can argue that a lot of private property has been unfairly assigned, and this is a general argument. But we can say that sometimes some methods involved abuse, sometimes they didn't. Regardless of that, that's how effectively people started owning land and the houses, the homes that went with it. And this continued throughout history. And it's quite interesting because, again, because of these power dynamics, power was concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. And gradually, what happened is rather than just the farmers owning the land, it was wealthier individuals or families owning land and letting farmers farm the land because they couldn't farm all the land they owned. And there were all sort of different types of agreements so that a farmer could live on a land and also farm that land. And some agreements involved sharecropping, meaning the farmer would pay a percentage of the harvest to the landlord. So that was one of the very ancient and still around to some extent, I have to say, type of agreements where farmers effectively can live in a place and all they have to pay is a percentage of what they they harvest. And there's different systems as well. For example, in the Roman Empire, there was a very common system that was called amphiteusis. It means that effectively the farmer could live in a property and it could treat the property as their own effectively. So they were also, on one hand, you may argue it's actually even more demanding than the current system because they also had to make improvements to the property, just maintain that. On the other hand, the rents were relatively low, starting at 10% of the harvest of the produce that they could make from that land. So starting from 10%. And there was a very interesting dynamic, very interesting opportunity. Usually, after about 20 years, the amphitheater, which is the person renting through amphiteusis, that person could literally buy the property outright by paying 15 times the yearly rent. So it's actually quite similar to a lease and some sort of mortgage without involving any debt, of course. But it's an interesting concept. So over the course of 20 years, making rental payments and then a lump sum of 15 years to buy the property outright. So that was a possibility. With sharecropping, especially later on, the percentage of produce became higher and higher. In fact, it was very common to have systems such as Metaillage in France, Mezzadria in Italy, and in similar concepts in different countries as well, where the split was usually 50-50. So the farmer would get 50% of the produce and the landlord would get the other 50%. And that stayed true, especially through feudalism. So the feudatory, meaning that the landlord had the opportunity to own a lot of land and get a lot of produce. So again, because this produce could be stored, that's where this accumulation of wealth became possible. And that's literally why private property took the form that we can see nowadays. But there's still a few steps before we get to the modern day with mortgages and the new concept of being homeowners, which in the past, being property owners was something that was reserved only for really the ultra wealthy or the monarchs and so on. Even though that doesn't mean they had full control over the properties, because it was never easy to evict someone, even if you're the king. Uh, but nowadays, owning where we live is something that is considered that pretty much everyone can do, as long as they can afford it. That's a different conversation we can have. But what changed? So, Gareth, what happened when mortgages were introduced?
Yeah, so I guess just to recap, Dan, you've basically covered up till the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages is a strange time, right? If we talk about between the 10th and 15th centuries, roughly. Bear in mind that most of my knowledge of the Middle Ages probably comes from the Monty Python movies, so I'm not an expert in this by any means. But in the Middle Ages, there were some concepts of property and feudalism, as you mentioned, where sometimes in the UK, for example, peasant farmers would be on the land and they would be basically paying all of their produce to the wealthy landowner, or the aristocratic or the royal landowner, in order to survive and get their shelter. And the feudalist landowner was the one that had effectively ownership of the property and the land. And so the turning point in this was really the transition to capitalism and the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. And these all kind of happened at the same time, right, from the 16th century onwards. And this is where it gets really interesting because things accelerated. This is modern civilization as we know it from the last, 350 years or so. And what that meant was the transition to capitalism. We still had wealthy landowners, often they were aristocrats, but now there was a pathway for people to generate money and be a bit more independent and get away from the feudalist system. And so if we go back to the 16th century, the concept of a mortgage actually emerged in England. And these early mortgages were typically used for land in the beginning. And an interesting source of the word mortgage comes from gage or gage, and mort. In the Old French, mort means dead, and gage or gage means a pledge. So it was effectively a death pledge. And if the borrower failed to repay on the property then died to the lender. So that's a really interesting source of where the word comes from. And then mortgages really evolved more in the 18th century. This is where things really started to change. And if we look at, again, the United Kingdom, which was the source of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, arguably, it actually became possible for a working class regular person in the 1800s to become a property owner. It was still very difficult and it was mostly reserved for the wealthier segments of society. But what happened was that the development of building societies or mutual organizations happened. And these were the first institutions that provided loans for property purchases. And a property loan is a mortgage. And so it was possible, but very difficult for a working class regular person to save up money over many years and then buy a property and become a property owner through the use of these new building societies and organizations. And so, yeah, for the first time in history, it became possible maybe for people at the lowest level of society to actually own land and property and start to climb up the social mobility ladder. What personal experience have you had from that point of view, Dan, or have you observed before?
Great analysis, Gareth. And by the way, I like the reference you made about the word mortgages with that. Something interesting along the same line is in the emphyteusis contract, effectively the ability for the amphitheota to buy the property outright was called enfranchisement, which is a word, enfranchisement, that literally means liberation of a slave. So there was already connection with um, feeling like a slave or lack of freedom by not owning a property. And once they own the property, there's a freedom element involved. It's intrinsic in the language used as well. But yeah, just to answer your question regarding personal experiences, what we noticed is that if you look at these very old contracts where people only had to pay 10% of the produce, sounds a lot more reasonable than what nowadays we're paying. And we notice that a lease or a mortgage or rental payments usually are much, much higher in terms of percentage of what people earn to live in a specific place. So all of a sudden, we live in some sort of job market where, in order to be present in a certain job market, uh, we have to pay a price, and therefore, if for many people it just prices them out completely, whereas for other people it just takes a lot of value away. So there is a little bit of a dynamic going on right now because of the fact that landlords effectively can buy property in multiple countries, and by being wealthier, they could price out other people that actually want to live in a property, whereas the landlord never intends to live in a property altogether. And therefore, this could create some inequalities. But I want to have a conversation a little bit more in general about the fact that private property should exist or not exist and so on, because I hear very often a point saying, why don't we just abolish private property altogether and just go back to socialism? However, that also presented a lot of limitations. In fact, if no one owns anything in particular, first of all, no one is going to protect land, protect certain specific dwellings and so on. Okay, maybe you want to say the government does that. Fair enough. That creates a big element of centralization, though, which could potentially become an issue because then we let the government do all that. On the other hand, it's already been demonstrated that in a purely socialist system, innovation, incentives to really improve property and so on can just not be there. So if we want to grow as a society and if we realize the need for innovation, then potentially private property has a very big role and a very big importance. The other thing I want to mention is specialization. So in a society that is so refined, when people really specialize, the ability to acquire private property can also help. What's your take on all this, Gareth?
Yeah, there's some big concepts you've introduced there, Dan. So um, just to recap, the idea of should we not have private property to prevent this huge concentration of wealth? And just to go back to the history there and talk a bit more about what happened in the 20th century, it was just after World War II when it became a really big turning point in many developed countries because of economic growth and after the war, uh, soldiers returning home, huge population booms. There was a big demand for new housing, and so government policies in the West changed and made it much easier for people to buy their houses and actually get mortgage products. And so it really took off in the second half of the 20th century. And then in the 21st century, that trend continued, but of course, then we hit the financial crash, which was triggered by the property market, the subprime property market in the US. And this led then to the collapse of house prices temporarily and a lot of people losing their homes. And then after that, in the most recent decade or so, we've seen another boom in property prices after the financial crash and pre-COVID. And now we have a situation where property prices in the West are sky high in many places, such as London, where the the price of a property is many, many multiples of a person's salary, and increases in salary have not kept anywhere near the same level of increase as the increase in property prices. So now we have a situation where, again, it's very difficult for young people to get into the property market, and wealthier landlords owning multiple properties and then renting them out and maintaining their wealth through effectively the ownership of land and property, which was acquired in the past when it was easier to do so. So we have this huge concentration of wealth and power, and it's now becoming more difficult for people to own their properties again or buy a property. And so, as you rightly said, some people are saying, well, is this right? Should we have this concentration of wealth and power? And maybe the answer is to go to public property where nobody has private property, but then that has all the problems of the government then controls all land and property. And that would be fine if the government was competent and able to do that, and also benevolent and have the interests of the population at heart. So really controversial, and obviously moving to an entirely public property system would be a huge transformation, a political transformation that people are not really, they don't really have any appetite for that right now. So yeah, it really comes into some really intense conversations and intense energy around this issue right now of property. And so we're at a stage now where it's like, well, how can we change the way that property ownership and land ownership and wealth and power are distributed? Is there some way to do this in an innovative way? And I guess at the margins, governments have introduced buy to help schemes where you can put down a very small deposit and then own part of a property, for example, to make it easier for young people to get on the property ladder. But we think there's a much bigger space for innovation here, right, Dan? We think we could really go to the next level.
Exactly. And of course, as everyone knows by now, what we like to do here at ColivingDAO, we don't look at utopias, we look at what's the next step in order to significantly improve the current system. And what we've identified is the number one reason this concentration of wealth and power has been a problem is because it's been primarily a one-dimensional understanding of what capital is. So right now, If someone has a lot of money, they can buy a lot of property and get 100% of the voting rights of what should happen to the property. In my view, that's the main problem. It's not the fact that there's an imbalance in what people own, and I'm not expecting everyone to own exactly the same amount of property, because if everyone owned exactly the same amount of property, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. We would completely lose incentives in uh, doing things, producing and generating value in life. However, the problem is when there's this wealth that is accumulated, and in many cases have been accumulated through history, so not even in one lifetime, and it can be utilized to control entire lives of other people. So what we've identified is the opportunity uh, to shift from a one-dimensional understanding of capitalism, where the only capital that is considered is the financial capital, to a multi-dimensional capitalistic understanding of society, where there's actually multiple capitals at play. So imagine a society where all the money in the world could not buy all the governance rights in the world or all the property in the world. And that could be an interest or stake in a property. So with money, I could buy a stake in a property, but still no amount of money could buy the majority of the governance rights for that particular property. What this means is that all of a sudden we start recognizing different types of capitals, such as human capital. Now, living in a property and doing work for a property, improving that property has a lot of value as well. So why should we simply favor financial capital over all these other types of capital? So by utilizing this paradigm shift, we envision a society where all of a sudden we're not completely removing the inequalities, because that's not the point. The point is to make society fairer. And to make society fairer, we can shift to a multi-capital type of society where all of a sudden there will not be one person or just few people that have most of the capital, and therefore they can control everything. Now, what's interesting to note is that not every capital can be accumulated in the same way. So for example, financial capital is very easy to accumulate, very easy to pass on to the next generation, and so on. But when we look at human capital or labor capital, so to speak, we can't really accumulate that and store it and pass it to different generations. And with all the different types of capitals that are available, this is a dynamic that is shifting the concept of power. And therefore, power can no longer be accumulated in the same unfair way that we've seen throughout history so far. What's your take on this, Gareth?
Yeah, this is where it gets really exciting for me, Dan. So when you talked about the concept of multiple capitals beyond financial capital, I can probably hear some of our listeners going, "What? What is he talking about? This is crazy, right?" But this is where it gets really interesting, because if we think about social capital, and that sounds like a strange phrase, but bear with me, social capital is mostly recognized in the form of human connections, right? So when we talk about social capital, think about your friends and your family, and then extend that to your community and your neighborhood. The most obvious example of social capital is in your local community. And that is the connections that you have with people in your local community. You might go to the same shop, for example, and to buy your bread in the morning if you're lucky enough to have a bakery on your doorstep. And the conversation you might have with the shopkeeper there is a form of community social capital. You may have some friends in the area as well, and those friends are part of your community capital. Your community in effect, is social capital. And so a building is not just a structure that you paid for. A building is in a place, and a building is in a local community, in a local neighborhood. And the current system of property ownership does not recognize that these community links have value, the social links have value. They only recognize, hey, the building's made of brick and steel and glass, and the material is the only thing that has value. And this is a really strange way to look at the world, because if you go all the way back to the hunter-gatherers, they didn't look at materials as the primary form of wealth, right? When you go back to agriculture and the agricultural societies that started to build farms, they didn't look at bits of wood and brick as the only form of wealth. They were looking at their crops, the plants. They were looking at the people who were going to help them to build the farm. And so if we really step away from this narrow view on money and materials and look at what is wealth and what makes life good, right? And then apply that to property and private property. How does private property play a role in how we make our lives and our communities richer and better and wealthier in every multidimensional aspect? And that's where it gets exciting for me. So how do we build a private property model that brings in those elements of wealth?
Absolutely. And in fact, I can argue that by living in a certain property, I am being a good person, a good neighbor, and therefore I'm raising the value of the property and the neighborhood in general. And if every neighbor is doing the same, then why shouldn't we be rewarded for that? Because we are effectively adding value, just like the bricks add value to the property and the location adds value to the property, and being a great neighbor adds value to the entire area as well. So it's really critical to reward all this value that people are adding to a particular property just by living in there, and all the other types of capitals involved as well. And this is something that we are doing utilizing a company structure that is the fair shares common. So Gareth, how exactly is this company structure enabling all this?
Yeah, so at ColivingDAO, we're using the Fair Shares Commons, and it enables, first of all, in a simple sense, allows you to own where you rent from day one and have a real voice to shape your community. And how is that done? Well, the Fair Shares Commons enables multiple types of shareholders. And so quite simply, if you live in one of the ColivingDAO co-living communities and you pay rent every month, you actually then get shares in the company that owns the building. And so you become a shareholder as a resident, and that gives you a legal voice and a share in the voting power of how the community is shaped and how the building is managed. And having a voice, if all residents have a voice, when they get together and talk about how to make the community better, they are able to shape the community because they have power, they have shareholder power, they have voting power. And the investors and the property managers or the community managers also have voting power. And so there's a balance of power, and that enables the community to become more valuable because the residents have a say, and the building managers and the investors have a say, and other stakeholders have a say too. And what that does is the community then evolves according to the interests of all of those stakeholders. So when we talk about social capital and living in a community that's valuable, you can imagine what happens if the residents are cooperating on what kind of theme do we want in our community? What kind of events would we like to hold here? What would we like to do in the local neighborhood to help the local neighborhood? What does that look like? And so you get this really strong social connection and social sort of missions, and also just the fun of living in a place where people have like-minded interests and they want to make the community better in whatever way that looks like. And so the Fair Shares Commons is a new legal structure that enables multiple stakeholders to own shares and have a balance of power in the voting held by those shares. So it enables decentralization, decentralized power, and decentralized wealth sharing. And so this is a kind of it's kind of the same as private property as we know it, but it brings in a new way of looking at private property because you have multiple owners and multiple people who have a say in it. So it becomes kind of like a hybrid between public and private property. Is that the kind of angle you were looking at there, Dan, or is there one bit you want me to focus on more in the Fair Shares Commons?
Absolutely. I actually really like this expression that you use, the balance of power, because what we're looking to do here, we're not trying to eliminate power altogether. In doing so, we probably eliminate the incentives that people have in maintaining and improving, innovating property and so on, which means that that could very likely stifle innovation, stifle progress, stifle growth. That's not what we want. We don't want to go backwards, we want to go forward. And in order to go forward, what we're looking to do is to balance power and align the incentives. So in this particular legal framework, we see how everyone's incentives are aligned. Therefore, we no longer have this fights between landlords and tenants where effectively they have a completely contrasting goals and ambitions, and they have to fight each other in this sort of zero-sum game where the more one gets, the less the other one gets. In this way, we are playing a non-zero sum game where we can create more abundance and create a society where everyone can cooperate. So this is why this structure is completely revolutionary, and we can definitely see how a lot of things can change. In fact, uh, the key elements here are, first of all, detaching the financial capital from the voting power, meaning a landlord only has a limited voting power. Just because the landlord owns a big chunk of the property financially doesn't mean that the landlord should get even the majority of the voting power. And that is something that is a big game changer. At the same time, just like you mentioned, decentralizing wealth, decentralizing governance rights can effectively lead to better decisions. And this is why the Fair Shares Commons is extremely powerful. And the word commons in there is very interesting because if we think at the concept of commons as something that is not owned by anyone and is just public, but we've seen what the limitations are for something that is purely public. Right now, we have a new concept of commons where it's not privately held by one individual, but it's also not completely public, but it's a commons within the frame of a number of people, a number of stakeholders, and therefore everyone is incentivized in making sure that the best happens to that particular property. That is what I consider very, very innovative and a massive, massive game changer. So this is why we are working along those lines. So any final thoughts, Gareth, on the direction that the world is taking, that we are taking, and what we are looking to create?
Yeah, that brings it back nicely to where we started, actually. When you talk about the commons, Dan, as public property that everyone has an interest in, like the air we breathe and the water that cycles around the planet, we all share those resources. And so ColivingDAO has created a new way, a new blueprint for private property that brings in the commons, that public property element, and sharing and cooperation around the resources in a community, in a building. And in a strange way, that takes us all the way back to the hunter-gatherers, as you said right at the beginning, Dan. When they go and hunt together, they then share the food, even if the best hunter captures the most animals, or even the best forager captures the best vegetables and fruits. They then share it with each other. They're sharing the commons. So what we have now is a situation where how do we combine the best of the most modern technology and the most modern ways of approaching things and bring back some of that sharing and cooperation from our ancient ancestors? And this is the recipe that we've put into the DNA of ColivingDAO, bringing the best of the modern world and the ancient world together and the concept of shelter and sharing, which is what all humans need in the fairest way possible. And so this is really exciting for me. We're taking private property ownership with ColivingDAO, and we're bringing it back into a sharing cooperative model, but keeping all the benefits of power, control, innovation, and having a place to call home that you have real power and control over, and a wealth building aspect, but you're sharing it and cooperating with the people in your community too. So that's really exciting for me, and I can't wait for us to continue in this path.
Absolutely, and that's a very big leap forward, which we're all working hard to make a reality, and we're looking forward to it. So just to wrap it up, thanks everyone for being here. Gareth, thank you so much for your insights. And this is Daniel signing off. Everyone, subscribe to this podcast, and I'll see all of you in the next episode.
Thanks, folks. See you in the next one.